board because there were a few people that couldn't make it with us today. My name is Alan White, and I'm going to host the Rooted webinar. I am a coach with the Rooted Network, and so glad to be on here with you today. With me is Robin Riley. Robin is the Chief Strategist. Now, I am impressed with that title at Mariners Church in Irvine. And so, Robin, glad to have you with us today.
Thank you.
And then Caleb Anderson is the lead pastor of Mariners Church in Huntington Beach, California. So, Caleb, very, very glad to have you with us as well.
Thank you, Alan.
So thank you all for coming. Thank you for responding to my my email blast this last week, and the rest of you, I don't know, maybe social media or you found some other way, but glad to have you with us. And we're going to take about the next 45 minutes, talk about Rooted, and then depending on time, we may have some time to take questions at the end of our session. So let's get going here. All right. So we're glad you're here. Well, I already introduced us, but here we are. So, all right, Caleb, do you want to get us started off?
I will. So I'm Caleb, and I lead the Mariners Church in Huntington Beach, and I have been at this for just under 4 years, and it has been such an incredible journey. I want to make sure that you understand that Mariners Huntington Beach, when you think of Mariners Church, you probably, if you have any frame of reference, you think of the church on the Irvine campus, which is very large, very beautiful, and we're talking like 8,000 people. I lead and teach and office and everything in Huntington Beach, affiliated with Mariners. We're in relationship. We're doing this together, but it's pretty much an autonomous church, and it's not sexy. We meet in a public library, in a theater, sure, attached to the public library, but it's still a public library. So I want you to know that I have the perspective of a mega church of 8,000 and a church that meets in a public library that has grown from 100 to 1,000 in the past 4 years. So, and Rooted has played a huge role in that, and I'm excited to share a little bit about that with you. Let me just first give you a brief history of Mariners Church. In 60 seconds, I'll tell you that Mariners Church started 50 years ago, and it started in a home with like 6 families. And it outgrew that home quickly, and it moved to a elementary school named Mariners Elementary School. And from there, it got property, and now it resides on this great property in Irvine, right on the corner, right on the border of Newport Beach. It survived through a split, a merger, so churches that split and then came back together, which is unusual. But when that happens, there's all kinds of mixtures of past founding pastors and the new pastor and the pastor from the church that split, and then the pastor that didn't work out, and then the church comes back. So there's all these mixtures of philosophy and change, and then this time where Kenton Beshore has been in leadership over the past 30 years. And what it developed was an overgrown ministry structure. Trying to be all things to all people. Mariners developed a menu model of ministry. You might understand that, where it's like, you want a little bit of this? We got that for you. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. All of a sudden, you have pastors of sports ministries. You've got pastor of the non-sports ministries. You've got pastors of women's ministries who like sports. You've got all these paid positions and ministries and part-time things, and these guys that are trying to have a place for everyone in the church to hook onto, and all of a sudden, you've got this monstrous menu of stuff that the church does. You're trying to support and talk about and fund, and it becomes this massive machine. And then you wonder, where are we really taking these people? Sure, maybe they have places where their affinity plugs them in, but are we taking them anywhere? And do we have any intentional strategy to get them from A to Z? And we at Mariners had a very clear lack of a pathway, of strategy from A to Z. It was kind of a catch-all. We hope that you stick. We hope that someone will plug in somewhere. And then it was approximately 7 years ago. There was a staff person that came on staff who was living in LA, moved down to Orange County, and he came on staff. His name's Christian Mungai, and he was from a church in Kenya. And he said, I got to take you to my church in Kenya called Mavuno, and you got to see what we're doing there. So some of the staff went, Kenton went over to Mavuno in Africa, saw that they were doing this thing called Mizizi, which means rooted in Swahili. And it was this brilliant 10-week process of taking new people, old people, members of the church through an experience, moving them down this road of discipleship. So we saw that working there. It triggered something. We brought the concept back, rewrote it, created it, contextualized it for Mariners, for Orange County, for Americans, and off we went, starting with staff at Mariners, and then some elders and key leaders, and then launching it out to the entire church. And now 3 times a year, every single year, we launch Rooted, and new people jump in to the point where 80% of the folks that are as a part of our church have gone through Rooted, and still more keep coming in every session 3 times a year, every year. Let me tell you just about some of the results that we have seen in Rooted before I break down some of the practicalities a little bit more. Just the quick results that we've seen. By the way, I didn't write this. I'm not selling this. I'm just telling you this thing is what God is using to bless our churches. And now not just Mariners churches, but like 110 churches around the country who are doing this and using it. And it's unbelievable, because 90% of the groups that start through Rooted, so we gather people together in groups of somewhere between 8 and 15. 15 is a little bit on the high side. Sometimes it goes more than that if we don't have enough leaders, but we find our way in that zone. 90% of those groups continue on as small groups after Rooted, after the 10-week journey. 90%. So 3 times a year we add small groups. Usually at our church in Huntington Beach, it's usually about 6. 3 times a year, new groups added to our church, and they continue on. 70% of the people involved in those groups stick. Some don't. Some feel like, oh, you know, this was great, it's been real, but I'm going to go into this group or whatever. But 70% stick and stay in the groups where they did their 10-week journey through Rooted. 82% of the people that go through the 10-week journey increase their giving. It's just part of it. You know that that's part of discipleship. That's part of trusting God. And in week 8 of Rooted, we go deep into giving and why give, and addressing the cultural stigmas of giving and why it's so hard and why pastors don't like to talk about it, but it's still so important because it matters to God. And so as a lead pastor, I love Rooted so much for what it does, plugging people into groups and community, but helping them on this journey of understanding what giving is too. And 82% giving goes up. People either that are already giving to our church increase their giving, or people that are not yet giving to our church begin giving in 82% of the situations and 82% of the cases. 70% of serving goes up. So either people are already serving and they serve more, or they're not yet serving and they start. That serving includes serving on Sundays, but it also happens all during the week through what we call outreach or mobilization and kind of getting outside the walls and into the community. 70%. Start it in Rooted. We do that on kind of the week, I believe it's week 5 or 6, and then they continue on after the fact. Rooted, we've seen it be relevant to all stages of faith. I could give you examples right now of people going through Rooted at our church who are fresh into our church. They showed up on a Sunday, something moved them, God's Spirit tugged them in a direction. They signed up for Rooted that day, their first Sunday. This happens every time. They signed up for Rooted that day, and they're learning about what it means to follow Jesus. I just heard a story about someone who has decided to follow Jesus as a result of this Rooted in the past couple of weeks. And at the same time, we have people that have just jumped into our church. They've moved here from somewhere else. They're in their 60s, and they are going through Rooted and having a fantastic experience. We have people that lead large nonprofits that director of FCA for the West Coast, is in our church, and he loves Rooted. He helps us. After he went through Rooted, he wanted to lead Rooted groups because it just works for the whole spectrum of people, because you're bonding together as a group and because you're going somewhere together talking about things that matter. And even if you're like a long-term follower of Jesus, you get re-energized by seeing other people's journey discovering Jesus or breaking through some kind of patterns or perspectives or paradigms that they needed to shake out of that they've had from the past. And so it ignites them too. It hits all stages of faith, and it activates faith and shows people a way to live it out in their everyday life. So it shifts from just kind of like ethereal intake of information to what do we do about this? How do we get out? How do we go? How do we serve? How do we contribute? Let me move to the next slide, getting people into groups. So one of the things that we say, I think that I probably ripped this off from Andy Stanley, is that rows we move people from rows to circles, and circles are even more important than rows. Rows are about inspiration, circles are about transformation. So as someone who took over a church that was struggling at 100 people, it was so meaningful to me that there was a system already in place that Irvine Mariners had learned from Mavuno in Africa that I could instantaneously insert into what we were doing. And we would move people from the auditorium in their seats into circles where they could get connected immediately. So many people are struggling with that, wrestling with that. How do we get people into small groups? What's our strategy for that? This Rooted just makes the most sense. It's the best thing that I have seen. I've been around a while, working at Saddleback Church for 5 years and up and down the West Coast. It's just working, and people are responding, and God is transforming lives. And we have effectively 3 times a year moved people into groups, and they stick, and they stay, and they make meaningful relationships. The second bullet point here is that it's one thing. So this is so helpful because instead of me standing up on the platform every Sunday and saying, here are the 4 ways that you can plug into our church. If you like this, go here. If you like this, go. I don't do that. All I ever say is, you're new to our church, get into Rooted. If you've been in our church for a while but your schedule hasn't allowed you to, do Rooted now. You got to jump in. This is your next step. This is everybody's next step. And 3 times a year, our whole church anticipates that they know we're going to talk about it, we're going to hit it hard, we're going to jump on that bandwagon. And you might ask yourself, well, why? What do you do for the people in between those 3 sessions a year? And that's easy. We help them plug into other ways, and we tell them, you just got to wait, 3 more weeks, 1 more month, 6 more weeks until the next Rooted, because it's worth it. The momentum that generates from a group of people at Irvine, it's anywhere from 500 to 1,000 every session. In Huntington Beach, it's anywhere from 75 to 125 every session. And the momentum that comes through that is worth the wait. And so people are happy. They've heard about it. They're happy to wait a few weeks until the next session starts. And we just tell them, this is the one thing. This is what you do. This is our pathway. You come in through the weekend, we move you into Rooted, you stay in a life group, and then you go out from there and change the world is kind of the way that we look at it. So the final bullet point here for me is what's different about Rooted. And the basic thing is it's not a Bible study per se where you're just taking in information. It's an experience. And we talk about it not being programmatic, it's experiential. So we invite people into a journey with our church, but with this other group of people, so that they're building relationships and those relationships stay, so that they're learning new habits and they continue those habits after the 10 weeks, so that they're learning to serve together, to pray together, and that they continue to serve together, they continue to pray together after the 10 weeks. And it's made such a difference in the life of our church in Huntington Beach and the life of Mariners Church in Irvine and the Mariners Church in Mission Viejo and the Mariners Church in San Juan Capistrano that our friends, that people like you have contacted us and just said, hey, tell us more about this. We've been hearing about this Rooted thing. And You see Rooted Gathering, experiencerooted.com, Rooted Network, all that stuff is simply a reaction and a response to what we see God doing. We didn't plan for this to happen. We're just responding to what we sense God is doing. And so we want to invite you to this Rooted Gathering that is June 16 and 17 at Mariners Church in Irvine. Not a bad place to be in June. And you'll get 2 days of experiential learning, and it'll be fantastic. So I turn it over to Alan. Alan, will you take it from there?
I will. And there were just a couple questions that came up while you were talking. Somebody asked if you can use Rooted with existing groups along with starting new groups. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, absolutely. You absolutely can. The part of the power of it is helping people see that Rooted is what we do. So it's not as effective if you just throw it in as one of the options. Here's just something your group can try. But when you start to move your church at it, it's so catalytic. But absolutely, if you already have existing groups, you just roll them into that and you say, here we go. If I were you, I'd be starting in the fall or January, depending on where you are in your thought process. So in January, we're going to jump in with this, and we're going to do this together. If you're already in a group, here's what it's going to look like. If you don't have a group yet, great, we got you covered. We've already cherry-picked a few leaders that we know can lead these groups. We do training. We have training videos and all that stuff for the leaders or facilitators. So absolutely.
And then the other question, some of your questions, I'm seeing them, but they're going to be answered. You're getting a little ahead of us. But it's good that you're, curious minds want to know here. But one of the questions, Caleb, is this necessarily a church-wide campaign? Does the weekend service need to go with the Rooted material? What does that look like?
No, absolutely. That's a good question. So I wouldn't put this in the category of church-wide campaigns. I know that some churches that have, and so for 10 weeks when they were onboarding everybody and initiating Rooted in their church, they taught on similar sessions. So in the 10 weeks, there's 5 days of reading each week around the different themes, and so they would teach on that theme on Sunday, and that's fine, but it's not sustainable. You can't do that 10 weeks, 3 times a year. That's your sermon content for 30 weeks out of the year. That just doesn't work. But what it's become for us, it's just the norm. So it's just going on all the time, 3 times a year, onboarding new people, starting new groups, and then we still do some campaigns here and there, like once or twice a year. We'll do a different campaign for the other groups and people that have already gone through, and then we integrate the Sunday with that. So we're still believers in that, and that's still effective. But Rooted is like the underlying engine that moves discipleship forward for everybody in our church.
Okay, and one more question. I think this is an important one for you to answer since you are a lead pastor. Mark asks, does the senior pastor need to be on board for this to work successfully?
Yeah, Mark, that's a good question. And the answer is yes. They need to be on board. They don't need to be on board from day one if they're a little bit shaky on it. What we would encourage you to do is just do a pilot with some of your staff, with a handful of groups, so that the senior pastor can see the power of it. But before you launch church-wide and say that this is what we do, yeah, he needs to be on board, because it really informs the methodology of how we bring people in and get them into groups and go forward. And it's worth it. It's worth waiting and getting that person on board because of the power they can have when it's integrated into the life of your church.
I was talking to a pastor, small groups pastor of a church in Texas that's recently, they went through their first session of Rooted. They were having their celebration, and they said as their senior pastor witnessed, the number of people who stood up and proclaimed, "I believe," during the celebration, indicating they were putting their faith and trust in God, and the number of people that were baptized after their celebration, it began to dawn on their senior pastor the significance of what Rooted was doing in their church. So their pastor wasn't necessarily a raving fan at the beginning. He wasn't against it. But once he saw the results of it in that celebration, that's completely changed his thoughts about Rooted. And so when they go to launch this again, he's very much going to be on the front of that. So that's pretty amazing. I know many of you have questions. We'll hit them at the end. And some of them will answer as we go. Sorry, Caleb, I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. I would just say one other thing about that. So the thing that senior pastors get excited about is the impact that this thing has in terms of integrating everything that they really care about. And so there's the giving component, people learning to give. There's the serving component, people being mobilized to serve. There's also this factor of new people being drawn to the church. We have people every Rooted session that sign up for Rooted that don't yet come to our church on Sundays because people talk about Rooted. And it's become a thing in the community that others have just been seeking out, and even some people from other churches that maybe they still want to go to their church, but they come to ours because their church isn't doing Rooted and they want to go through Rooted. So it's becoming a thing that people are learning about and that friends tell their friends about. And we every session we have a handful of people sign up that don't yet come to our church, and most of them end up coming to our church afterwards.
Jennifer suggests in the question box that their church did 10 weeks of Rooted with a sermon series, had 1,300 people go through it, and she says what's been useful about this, at any time people or groups can go through the Rooted sermon series online, and so they haven't found a need to go back and preach the messages again because people who want that content could go and discover it online.
It's a great idea.
Very good. Well, thank you, Caleb, and he'll be sticking around if you have questions at the end as well. How do you keep momentum going? This is the interesting thing about Rooted. I have been schooled and I coach a lot of churches in the methodologies around the church-wide campaign. And a church-wide campaign requires recruiting a lot of leaders, creating a lot of energy, creating a lot of momentum, and it effectively connects people into groups. But the other thing that I've seen, kind of the heartbreak of a church-wide campaign, has been the fall off after the end of 6 weeks. You have a lot of excitement. It's actually fairly easy to get a lot of excitement going for 6 weeks. And then at the end of it, it just falls off the cliff and you don't have anything left. The interesting thing, the fascinating thing I'm seeing with Rooted is that people are very selflessly, because of their own Rooted experience, wanting to go out and start Rooted groups to lead other people through the experience. And I am baffled by this because you and I both know recruiting leaders, getting leaders to continue, keeping them energized is like pulling teeth. But I tell you what, Rooted has created raving fans in their leaders and their group members and church staff unlike anything I've seen. And I really am not trying to overplay this. I am just completely fascinated by what I've seen both at Mariners Church and now over 100 other churches, various denominations, small churches, large churches, mega churches all over North America and now into parts of Asia and other places. I am really fascinated by this and the work that God is doing. People not only coming to Christ, but you know what? People getting out of the pew and getting involved, investing themselves in ministry. So how do you keep momentum up? Part of it has to do with group formation. Somebody was asking questions about group formation. At Mariners, the key to group formation and Rooted is, first of all, you want to look at life stage. So people that are at a similar place in life. Geography, especially if your church draws from a large geographical area. It's kind of hard to get people all to drive and find each other, but it also indicates sometimes, what neighborhood they live in, kind of indicates their lifestyle and kind of the place they are in life, all of that. But also, as much as possible, you really want to look at affinity. What do people have that would be related to? And then of course the other thing is for people to invite their friends. And I think as much as you can have existing relationship or as high of an amount of affinity that you can have in a group, the better chance that group has to continue on. The second thing that I encourage, and some churches are doing this better than others, is that everyone who's leading Rooted is coached by somebody. And initially it may be by you, somebody like you and me, somebody that's on a church staff that's coaching leaders within the church. Down the road, as you have more and more experienced leaders, it may be an experienced leader walking alongside a new leader, answering their questions, keeping them encouraged, praying for them on a regular basis. But these are a couple of keys I see to success in groups continuing on and continuing with the momentum. The other thing is to have a next step, that before the series ends, it's important to introduce to the group, here are some next steps. And there are a number of next steps. I should have put it up on the slide, but you can find it on the Rooted website of other series. There's one that's called Story that goes along the pattern of Rooted. There's one called Mystery that's coming out. Caleb's written one that's called My Near-Death Experiment. It's an interesting topic, but he's just done a very good job with that. And then Kenton's written one called Ask. But there are a variety of other studies. But here's what you do in a group. About 2/3 of the way through the 10 weeks, you want to let them know that there's something else that the group can do. And so here's, kind of if they're an existing group, here's some choices. If they're a new group, here's your choice, one choice. And you want the group to commit to move forward before the current series ends. You have a better chance of those groups continuing and sustaining. The other thing I'll say too is that as people get together and they're doing Rooted together, there's something about the experience that people have this thing that's deeply significant in their lives that they've shared together. And it bonds them together in a group. Again, unlike things that I've seen in other ways of forming groups. And because of that bond, they want to continue. They've gone through hard things together. They've dealt with hard things in their life. Maybe somebody came to Christ and they were baptized. And these aren't far-fetched kinds of ideas. I've been to the last 2 Rooted celebrations and have sat in the auditorium with thousands of graduates and hundreds of people baptized for the first time, making that commitment. And it truly is remarkable, the level of energy, and just to hear the stories from people that are there of what God's done in their life and things that they've overcome. And they go on and on about Rooted. Now, one of the things in Rooted or in any kind of curriculum, but especially with Rooted, is you really want to embrace the seasons and rhythms of the church calendar. What that means is there are good times to launch Rooted, and there are not so good times to launch Rooted. So looking at these seasons and rhythms, to have Rooted or to have a small group semester, if you will, that runs between September and November is kind of prime time in the fall. People are back off of summer and they're ready to get involved in something. And this is an optimal time of the year. November and December, not so much. It's very difficult to keep groups going, to have regular group meetings. And these are the times that you go from focusing on group meetings to focusing on group life. Now, what do I mean by group life? Well, they can certainly carry over some of the experiences that they participated in Rooted, like having a prayer time, serving together, even just having social time together, having a party, having fun. And so you want to embrace that during November, December, because really between Thanksgiving and the New Year in the U.S. at least, it's not a great time. I know Canada, you get your Thanksgiving a little bit earlier, so you probably want to start Rooted after your Thanksgiving if you're in Canada. January to March, again, another outstanding season to do the 10 weeks of Rooted, or if they've already participated in Rooted, to do some other kind of study. It doesn't have to be a 10-week study, but it is a good window. And so in that window, they could do, a couple of smaller studies that still fit into that time period. April through June, again, is another outstanding season to offer Rooted to your church, and as well as offer, other things, other studies to your small groups. And this has been the pattern of both Mariners Church as well as other churches. And then, of course, June and August, I mean, people are gone. But, what I've seen over the years is, you announce to people, okay, our next Rooted session, our next small group semester is going to start in September. So during the summer, here's what we'd encourage you to do. Get together and do a prayer time. Serve together. Go on vacation together. I've had groups go camping together. I've had one group go on a cruise together. They met somebody on the cruise that lived in our town, and when they came back, that person joined their group. And so there's a lot of things that groups can do, but balancing that idea of group meetings and group life is a big part of that. I know you guys have a ton of questions. We're going to get to as many of them as we possibly can, but to get the majority of your questions answered, I really would encourage you to come out in June to Mariners Irvine and participate there. Okay, so Robin, you peeked on there for a minute, and then I put you away, so I apologize for that. Okay, so
No,
Robin, there are a lot of questions about, do you start this with 3 times a year? How do you start? How many people do you launch at one time? How do you get prepared for this? So I'm giving you all the hard questions, Robin, so you can go for it.
love it. So let me give a little bit of context first.
Okay.
I've been in full-time ministry now for about 12, almost 13 years, came from a corporate background, and I've led outreach primarily for the last almost 9 years at Mariners, and just was privileged to be on the trip with our senior pastor and Lori, his wife. We went to Kenya, got to experience Mizizi, which is Swahili for rooted, in Kenya, and saw the transformation. And Kenton, as he looked his legacy, was so passionate about it being about building disciples and not a campus. And that's what started our journey. And so what I'd want you to hear through all of this is not that we're so smart or that we have anything figured out, more that this truly is a movement of God. We've seen the power of the gospel being transformative, not about head knowledge, not about Bible studies, but about changing lives and activating people's faith. And so what we're trying to do is just respond to all that God's doing and not mess it up, frankly. And so the best first step for anyone who's interested is to do a pilot group, because the fact that it's experiential discipleship and that it's not taught, the best way then to experience that is to go through it. And you're all leaders, you know how to facilitate groups. To the question about the senior pastor buy-in and what Caleb said as well, the best thing to start with is a group of key stakeholders and influencers in your church. That could be elders, it could be key staff members, key leaders of ministries, but people that are courageous spiritually, who are leaders in their own right and willing to try something new, and to be vulnerable, because as you go through the curriculum, the power of it, apart from the experiences, is the authenticity that it requires for the group, which is why we've seen such amazing results in the groups and the bonding. Recently, we just had a group. I helped lead a group, and because we had so many people show up at the last minute, there were 20 people, and they were all new married couples, almost all of them new to the church. And the co-leader and I thought, gosh, there's no way this group is going to stick together. It's too big. And by the end, they had decided not only did they want to stick together as a life group, but that they were going to rearrange schedules for the young moms and the dads to meet as a men and women's group, and then also as a life group, because they were so passionate about the life change that they'd all experienced. And we see that again and again, and that happens even in the pilot group, even with people who have been on staff, been in full-time ministry for a long time. A couple of great stories. We had a senior pastor of a church that went through, participated in the Rooted Gathering, and part of that is a serve experience, and he went through that and at the end shared that the serve experience changed his leadership and his church and how he viewed the mission of his church. Another senior pastor shared that going through Rooted changed his prayer life, which obviously will have a drastic impact on his church. So the key thing, again, is doing a pilot. And you can go on the website, experiencerooted.com, and purchase a pilot kit. That has 2 facilitator guides, 15 Rooted books. So you can launch a pilot anywhere from 8 to 15 people, and that will really allow you to experience it, to get the buy-in you need to move to launch. Now the question about, do you have to do a pilot? You don't have to. I advise it. I think it's wise, but we've also had churches that have heard so much about Rooted and have been influenced by other churches that they have relationship with, that they went all the way to an all-church launch as their first step. And then the next thing is the Rooted Gathering that's coming up in June. What we'll do there is really break down the what, why, and how of Rooted, allow everyone to share their stories of what's working in the different churches, the different contexts, what's been key and instrumental during the launch phase, but then also have some other breakout sessions specific to different ministry opportunities. There'll also be another session in the fall. We're working on that date if June doesn't work. And then the last thing, like Caleb said, there's now 110 churches and growing every week in the U.S. and even more globally that are using Rooted. And so what we've seen at Mariners over the last, gosh, almost 5 years is over 8,000 people. But in the last 3, just with the exponential growth of Rooted in the nation, we've seen over 30,000 people go through Rooted. And so here's a snapshot of some of those churches. But again, it's humbling, it's a privilege, and we're honored to try to support other churches and walk with you as you launch into the Rooted adventure. So that's kind of an overview of where we are, but I wanted to share one of the pastors that just completed his first Rooted session. They took 500 people through. It's Paul from Compass Christian Church in Colleyville, Texas. I'm just going to pull out, I think you'll have it later in your PowerPoint, but a couple quotes. Rooted is by far the best, most authentic discipleship process I've ever experienced. The secret to it is that it's not really something new. The basics of the faith are what's covered. Understanding the nature of God, the fall, redemption, dealing with strongholds and sin, activating people to mission. I can so totally see Rooted creating a legitimate movement and revival in the American church. And we're so grateful that we get to be a part of something like that and would be honored to have you join us. So again, here's the dates for the Rooted Gathering in Irvine. And then, Alan, back to what questions do we have?
Yeah, we have a lot of questions. And so, Caleb, if you're still around, we'll have you chime in as well. Steve is asking, are there any samples of agendas other churches have followed to implement Rooted that I can use to present to our leadership or informational materials?
It's a great question. So there is on the website also a free sample kit which gives you 1 week of the facilitator guide as well as the Rooted curriculum. And then online, when you with the pilot kit, you have training videos, and we're working on a, there's also a church implementation guide that you get with the pilot kit, and we're working on a new I guess, guidebook for the Rooted champions in the churches that'll go into a little bit more detail as to how to get from pilot to launch, particularly with your senior pastor and senior leadership.
All right. The next question is, could Rooted be used first with those mature groups who are looking for, quote, something more?
I'll take a pass at this, Caleb, and then let me, if you want to jump in. I think I just recently spoke to a church who did both. They launched Rooted with new invitation to new people through the weekend service, but then also launched all of their existing groups real time at the same time. And I think that's a great strategy because it really will radically, wonderfully change the culture of your church. And so if you already have your mature groups on board and in alignment with that, it creates even quicker momentum.
Yeah, that's what I would say too. I agree with that. And so as someone who came in and took over a church that had been around for a few years and was struggling, there were some people, I don't know if you're referring to these type of people or not, but there were some people that were kind of stuck and they almost needed to be outrun. You know, they almost needed to be just, hey, here's where we're going, you're going to come along or not, but this is the future. And so it does that too, because what Rooted does is it helps people to develop more of a missional heart and to see, oh, maybe the discipleship is not all about me and me learning the next little piece of information from XYZ study. Maybe I'm supposed to be engaged in the process of other people also coming to know Jesus and grow in their faith and relationship with Him. So that's what I would hope and pray for those, quote, existing or mature groups that you have, is that it catalyzes them to really be on mission and not think it's just about them, although they'll still get something out of it, most definitely. But one of the things that they'll get out of it is a heart and a passion for seeing other people encounter Jesus.
It's kind of like years ago, I had a small group leader came to me, and his group was wrestling with some just very minute point of doctrine. And he said, what do you think? I said, I think your group needs a service project. You know, rather than getting down to all of this minutiae. Not saying that doctrine is unimportant. I did not say that, but I just said for this group, they needed to do something to serve other people. Deborah writes, does Mariners use the same curriculum for all of their groups, or does each group choose their own? I'm assuming after Rooted.
Right.
Yeah. So, Robin, you can fill in the gaps here. We do both. We recommend some key resources to go after Rooted, and we say, but if you don't want to do that, here are a bunch of other ones that are great too. And you all have access to Amazon.com, so people on one hand are going to do what they want to do. On the other hand, we provide recommendations and a pathway of saying, here, one of these three options is probably your best bet for this next season. We'd encourage you to do that. And then as a catch-all, we do sermon-based questions as well. So there's a person on the team that will take the outline or the message from Sunday, crank out some discussion questions that get people to go further on that. And so the groups that just want to study based on the sermon from Sunday, we email those out as well.
All right, and then Chris asks, isn't it a long time to wait from April to September for people new to your church? I'm assuming to join a Rooted group. So they could join in September, they could join in January, they could join in April. So he's wondering if there's too long of a gap from April to September for people to join.
Yeah, that is a little bit of a gap, and we feel it a little, but not as much as you'd think, because groups are not consistent. And maybe you have some heroic groups in your church, but our groups are not super consistent over the summer. We kind of hope that they'll meet once a month, just because of kids and travel and schedules and all that kind of stuff. So no one's really beating down the door of plugging into a group during the summer. However, we do have opportunities for people to plug in, and so we'll move them into a project that's going on in the community. We'll move them into a trip to Mexico that we're doing so they can be in a van with 12 people and get to know folks that way. We'll, even if they really want to, we'll even let people jump into an existing small group if they already have a relationship or a friend, or we'll just make a connection. But we'll say, we would love for you to do Rooted the next time it's offered, because it's that important. So we're committed to helping people get connected. We just find that the momentum that comes from doing Rooted just these 3 times, and it's an all play, it's jump in, the momentum far exceeds, the benefit of the momentum far exceeds the downside of waiting.
And I think there's something to the anticipation of that. And if you look into even, I don't want to take it as crass as this, but if you look into some teaching on marketing and sociology and that sort of thing, the fact that there's limited availability does something to cause people to anticipate the next time and to sign up when it's offered, rather than just if it's offered any time, then there's no sense of urgency to get involved.
It's true.
All right. Mark asked, does it help to be a life group organization versus having a traditional Sunday school format?
I'll start with that one. I think you guys both can chime in on it. Alan, you have great experience in that department as well. I believe that it can work if you have a Sunday school model. If that's a high value to your church and you're seeing fruit from that, keep it. But I would begin to move people toward Rooted with no apology and reckless abandon, and then just see what happens. See how it plays out. What you begin to notice in the hearts of people and what they gravitate toward. It's not impossible to keep Sunday school going, but I think that what you'll find is your energy, your investment quickly begins to steer toward Rooted because of the power that you see in life change and not just intellectual take-in.
Absolutely. What I would add to that, back to the question about the mature groups, the first group I led during our all-church launch at Mariners Irvine was a group of women all had attended Mariners for 18 to 20 years. All were in 2 to 3 weekly Bible studies. And when we jumped in and started digging into Rooted, I was amazed and at the same time heartbroken that none of them felt comfortable praying out loud or talking about strongholds or being aware of really the transformational reality available to them through the gospel. And while they were a little hesitant at first, by the time we got through the prayer experience and into about week 6 or 7, they were so amazingly transformed that they didn't want to go back to more of the traditional Bible study environment. So I don't know if that would be true of any of the other churches or if that's unique to us in Irvine. But to Caleb's point, the energy we directed at some of the other things, we had to redirect to create capacity for the amount of rooted groups that we were managing.
Yeah, and the way I would go with that is I'm very much in favor of helping pastors keep their jobs. And so if your church is heavily invested in a tradition of Sunday school, then I wouldn't turn this into Sunday school versus rooted. I would try to figure out some way to implement rooted in Sunday school because, or at least to explain to them, we're going to start groups with rooted. Please don't take this as any kind of a threat to Sunday school. You're welcome to continue. It's one thing for people not to be in favor of something. It's another thing for people to be against something. And if the invasion of rooted is a threat to them, then they'll do everything they can to discourage it. So I wouldn't get in that kind of a battle. I don't recommend it. We'll let God do that kind of work in people's lives. All right, Robin, this one's for you. This is where you've lived for 12 years. How has Rooted helped your church to become more missional? And then the second question is, what was your church like in terms of being missional before Rooted and then after?
Great question. And we have a unique legacy of a nearly 30-year now outreach ministries that was founded by our senior pastor's wife. So we had a strong missional foundation in our church, but what was interesting, because one of the strengths of our outreach strategy is that we're separately funded from the general operating budget of the church. And so we are able to participate at a higher rate and level than maybe what would be traditionally set aside for outreach by our senior pastor at least. And yet some of the downside of that is it felt almost separate. You had this core group of people that were naturally bent towards serving the poor and the marginalized locally and globally. And yet it wasn't fully integrated into the life and the heart of the church. What Rooted has done, and what I've seen it do in other churches that maybe didn't even have that legacy, is make, the term has been very culturally relevant, but missional living mainstream and a part of the DNA and the culture of the church, so that it's not even a question of if someone's going to serve, but it's when and it's where and it's with who. And so what's been so fun is to watch how life groups together become passionate about a cause and own it, and it's an extension of the church. Outreach Ministries has grown exponentially through the number of volunteers serving, but not the number of ministries, because we're not institutionalizing everything. The body of Christ is doing the work and loving it. And so that has been so awesome to see, because that was always, I think, the heart and the vision for Lori, but we didn't have the mechanism to make it happen.
Yeah, I like that. And I like the idea that there is, I don't want to say it's peer pressure, but there is a thing where someone's encouraged because the group is doing it, and it's something that they would never take on their own or never sign up for on their own, but they are kind of enter into experience. Now I feel like I'm talking about my 14-year-old, but now they enter into experiences they may not have done on their own, but they're going with the group, and it's all good things. It's not things that my 14-year-old is going to get in trouble with. Brian asks, and maybe we didn't do a good job of explaining this, but what are the experiences that people encounter that are beyond the educational or informational-based teaching?
Okay, so in week 3 we talk about prayer, and then we have a prayer experience that is even separate from that gathering. So they schedule a time to meet together and to pray. And for some people, it freaks them out, and they show up like quivering. I'm not going to pray out loud. I'm not going to pray out loud. For other people, it's normal, but it's a cool opportunity to see people interact in this way. They go off, they pray by themselves, they come back, they share what it was like, and if they're courageous, maybe there'll be a little bit of time of group praying. But the whole point is that it's accessible to everybody, and there are people every single session that tell us, I prayed for the first time, often in years, or the first time ever out loud, or whatever the case may be. And then we move them toward a serve experience, which we have each group choose an opportunity in the community somewhere to go and to serve. Oftentimes our churches will outline opportunities just to take the barriers out of it. Here are a bunch of needs, and you can go and you can sign up and you can meet these needs together. And then at the same time, we encourage our groups, if you know of a need that we don't know about, go and meet that need. Take care of that person. Solve that problem as a group. The key is that they have the experience together for 1 or 2 hours, and then they meet and they debrief the experience and talk about how it went. The third one is that we encourage people to share their stories. And we talk a little bit about evangelism and try to demystify the word and not make it as weird, and just talk about how it's sharing what God has done in your life and helping people write out a couple of paragraphs about their journey and try to share it with somebody else during the week, and it moves them gradually in that process of being more comfortable with that idea and doing that thing. And then ultimately the last deal is baptism. And so at the celebration we invite people that haven't been baptized yet to take that step of faith.
That's good. That's very good. And it's interesting because, and I'll say this kind of, I feel like I'm the outsider in a way because I live, on the other side of the country. But, when I first picked up the Rooted materials and looked at it, and I've seen a lot of curriculum, I've made a lot of curriculum over the years, the Rooted materials in and of themselves are not that remarkable. However, what God does in people's lives by going through these experiences and the materials, the daily pieces and all of that has produced results. I mean, and I'm not trying to sound over the top, but it has produced results unlike I've ever seen from anything else. And honestly, I'm still trying to figure out how it works so I can rip it off and make my own. No, I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding. All right, so Robin, there's a question about leaders. How do you recruit leaders? How do you develop leaders? You have all these groups that are ongoing. How do you keep leaders in there? Because we all know recruiting and keeping leaders is a task sometimes.
Right, and I think you hit on this a little bit earlier. So what I would say first off is a key distinction about Rooted is that it's facilitated, not led. So anyone who views leading a group more from I'm going to lead a Bible study and teach on a particular topic, that's not what we're looking for, which actually broadens your net quite a bit. And so we're looking for people that have a heart to see other people experience God and a heart for discipleship, which ultimately is about hearing God's voice and then being courageous and obedient. And so what does it look like to walk that journey with a group of people with the curriculum kind of guiding you? And so that's a much easier ask of someone. And then once they've gone through Rooted, again, it's so exciting to watch what God does, and it's created such a buzz that in the Rooted group, we're always having the facilitators look for two things. One, someone who's going to continue facilitating the group as a life group, but then also someone who naturally is so passionate about Rooted, they're going to want to go on and lead a Rooted group. And so that's built into the cycle, which creates this ongoing momentum. And then also during the Rooted 10 weeks, there's always a facilitator training or dinner before Rooted. So it's 1 hour every week. They're getting equipped, they're getting coached and discipled as well, and that's ongoing and follows into the life group rhythms that you went through on the seasons and rhythm chart. So it's a continuous process, and yet there's a lot of natural momentum built into it.
That's great. Now somebody's asking about if the Root is available for high school. Root is available in English, Spanish, Mandarin, Korean, and there's a high school edition. Have you developed any other ones since last week that I don't know about?
Well, we're piloting one called Seated, which is for children's ministry. So it's been adopted, follows the same values and principles, but obviously age appropriate. So we'll be looking to roll that out soon after we get through the beta and get all the feedback and refine it.
See, and I'm glad that I asked if there were any new developments, because there is a new development. I was kind of joking. This thing is just, I didn't know there was Mandarin and Korean last time I talked to you guys. All right, let's see. I think we've tackled most of the questions. Some folks were asking, after the webinar is over, I will send you a copy of the slides. I'll send you a link to the recording as well as a link to the website. A lot of the a lot of questions that are being asked, you can find information on the website. There are some explainer videos. There's a page of testimonies of people that have participated in Rooted at various different levels, and so you can find a lot of that information there. One question that did intrigue me here is Jenny asked, how do you equip or train your Rooted leaders for breaking strongholds in prayer? Is there specific training that needs to be applied there?
Yeah, so we have videos that help train facilitators. In Huntington Beach, we meet with the facilitators every single week. During one of our services, there will be a side room, and the facilitators will be being trained for the session that's coming up that week in real time, just to process that stuff, because it's not easy. And that's why the Strongholds Night is later in the journey, so that there's more trust, there's more time built in to get to know, to build trust with your facilitator and go through the process. By the time that people get there, you'd be surprised, they're willing to share some stuff. And some groups are willing to share some stuff week one, and you're like, whoa, okay, I guess we're there. Other groups, it takes all the way until week 8 or whatever it is to really unload and open up and share. But we provide real-time coaching for those facilitators the week that they need it, and we remind them that God is ultimately doing this and that they can trust Him to move people. It's His Spirit that's doing it. They don't have to be heroic all-stars. There's just some best practices to keep in mind, and then trust God to do what He's going to do. What else would you add to that, Robin?
No, I think the only thing is that also we break the groups out by gender. So men and women meet separately with a male and female person to pray, which also creates a much safer environment.
Yep.
Very good. Now, so my friend Joseph asked a question, and I texted him to make sure it was a serious question. And it is a serious question. He says, can a non-Christian facilitate a Rooted group?
Interesting.
This is called Stump the Panelists.
Well, I'll take Caleb.
Go ahead, Robin.
Well, I was just going to say, I think for us that's not our intent. We certainly have a lot of non-Christians in the Rooted groups, but all of our facilitators are believers and Christ followers.
There you go.
Yeah. If the question is can they, I think the answer would be yes. If the question is should they, I would lean toward no, because you can facilitate the process and God's Spirit can absolutely work, and I would believe that that person facilitating it would probably come to know Jesus through the process. However, we want our facilitators praying for their people every week, having follow-up conversations, investing in their lives, being accessible, all that kind of stuff that you would need to be engaged with Jesus to have to be there.
All right. And then Valerie asks, how does the material get shaped from church to church, cultural, language, doctrine? And so let me start with that one. Valerie, I've been talking to churches the last month from all across North America. And I mean, denominations, Anglican, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, Foursquare, other kinds of Pentecostal, Friends, and if I'm leaving somebody out, I'm sorry. And you know what's interesting to me, independent Christian churches, what's interesting to me is occasionally there is a little bit of wording that maybe they would say it differently from their theological tradition. But for the most part, there's been nothing that's really needed to have any kind of a major overhaul. And for the most part, it's fit with the mission and vision of the church. And what's been encouraging for a lot of churches is finding other churches that have gone ahead of them, have participated in Rooted, that are either from their neck of the woods or from their theological tradition or a similar size that they can learn from, and to say, how did you guys handle this, or what did you do with this? And it's really been interesting to see the number of people, a number of different types of churches that have participated, and yet they're all reporting back these incredible experiences.
Yeah. I think the only thing I'd add to that is that what we've heard, how the contextualization has worked well, is through the facilitator training. Almost all the churches do the same thing, like Caleb mentioned, where they're meeting with the facilitators every week for an hour, and that's where if there's any language or contextualization, that gets done through the training and the equipping of the facilitators, but hasn't resulted in a need to change the actual content.
All right. I know these guys have a ton of other questions. We're actually way over our time, but we wanted to answer as many as we possibly could. So for next steps, what would you guys say? Go to the Rooted website. They can get more information.
Go to the Rooted website, be in touch with us. Our team will follow up. And if you can come to this event, June 16th and 17th, please do. It's really inexpensive. I think it's like less than $100, right, Robin, or like right around $100. And if that's an issue for you, just talk to Robin about it. And we just want you to be there because we believe in what God's doing. So we want to facilitate that. And then, Robin, anything else you want to add?
No, just that I'm available by email also for any questions that were addressed today.
Thanks.
Very good. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am happy that we've had 50, 60 people that have sat with us now for over an hour and have asked very good questions, showing a lot of interest. So glad to have you guys on here to be a part of this. And like I said, check out the Rooted website. There are a lot of videos explaining more details about Rooted, stories you can hear from other churches as well as individuals, and the impact that God has had on their life through Rooted, and just how Rooted has managed to, has catalyzed transformation in lives of individuals, in churches, redoing ministry structures, all kinds of things. It's really an exciting thing to see. So I will send you the things I promised earlier in an email this afternoon. There's also the registration page if you want to come out and be with us at the Rooted Gathering. So glad to have you. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Caleb, for your time today. And I hope that God has sparked something in your heart, and I know that great things are going to come as a result of our time together today. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.